What if 20% of the world's daily oil production suddenly disappeared overnight and stayed missing? Would gas stations run dry? Would planes stop flying? Would supermarkets run out of food? Probably not. At least not at first. The lights would still be on, roads would still be busy, ships would still cross the oceans. But underneath that normal surface, something much more dangerous would begin happening. The world's oil supply would suddenly have far less room for mistakes. Prices would react, governments would release reserves, companies would scramble for new supplies. And then a harder question would emerge. When there isn't enough oil for everyone, who gets the oil that's left? Because the real crisis wouldn't begin when the world runs out of fuel. It would begin when the world starts running out of flexibility. The first hours would be strangely ordinary. If 20% of the world's daily oil production vanished at once and stayed missing, most people wouldn't notice anything immediately. Cars would keep moving, airports would keep operating, trucks would continue leaving warehouses. The reason is simple: oil already exists in storage, inside pipelines, on ships, and at refineries. The world has buffers. But those buffers were never designed to permanently replace a missing fifth of daily production. And the first day would reveal just how valuable those buffers really are. Within hours, traders would begin reacting to the missing supply. Oil producers with spare capacity would suddenly become more important. Countries would examine their strategic reserves. Refineries would start looking for alternative crude supplies. None of this would necessarily be visible to someone driving to work. The gas station could look completely normal. But behind the scenes, governments, companies, and entire countries would already be competing for the oil that remained. And the longer the shortage lasted, the harder it would become to hide. By the end of the first day, the first visible warning would probably be a number on a screen. The price of crude oil. As traders compete for fewer available barrels, prices could rise sharply. Producers with spare capacity would gain leverage. Countries holding strategic reserves would face a difficult decision: release them now or save them for a longer disruption. And this is where the situation becomes counterintuitive. The world doesn't need to physically run out of oil for the shortage to hurt. Higher crude prices would move through refineries and into the fuels people actually buy. Transport companies would face higher costs. Airlines would pay more to operate flights. Manufacturers would spend more moving raw materials. Then the effect reaches something much closer to home. A truck leaves a warehouse carrying food toward a supermarket. The truck still has fuel. The supermarket still has food. Nothing has stopped. But every kilometer of that journey has become more expensive. Multiply that across millions of deliveries, ships, farms, factories, and flights, and a shortage that began in the oil market starts appearing throughout the economy. The oil hasn't disappeared from your life yet. Its rising cost has. By the end of the first week, people and businesses would start looking for the easiest ways to use less oil. Drivers might combine trips, companies could reduce unnecessary travel, airlines might adjust routes, manufacturers could look for more efficient ways to move goods. For some people, cutting back would be inconvenient. For others, it wouldn't be an option. A farmer still has to plant and harvest crops. A fishing vessel still needs fuel to reach the water. A delivery truck still has to move essential goods. An emergency vehicle can't simply decide to make fewer trips because diesel has become expensive. And this is where the shortage becomes harder to manage. A commuter can skip a trip. A farmer facing harvest season cannot. The difference matters because some parts of the economy can reduce oil use while others simply cannot. When fuel becomes scarce, the sectors with no easy substitute are forced to compete for it. That pressure would also spread between countries. An oil-importing nation with limited foreign currency may struggle to compete with wealthier buyers for the same barrels. A country with domestic production has far more room to absorb the shock. And suddenly, the question is no longer simply how much oil the world has left. It's who can afford to stop using it. By the end of the first month, the shortage would no longer be something governments could simply watch from the sidelines. They would have to decide what matters most. Fuel for ambulances, diesel for farms, jet fuel for airlines, fuel for cargo ships, or gasoline for millions of private cars. In most countries, governments would try to protect critical services and essential supply chains. Strategic reserves could be released, fuel-saving measures could be encouraged, industries might be pushed to reduce consumption. But every decision creates another trade-off. Give more fuel to agriculture and another sector gets less. Protect domestic transport and imports may become more expensive. Release too much from reserves and there is less protection if the shortage lasts for months. And internationally, the imbalance could become even sharper. Countries with large domestic oil production would have more options. Import-dependent countries would have to compete for increasingly expensive supplies. For a country that cannot produce enough oil of its own, this isn't just an economic problem. It becomes a question of bargaining power. When there isn't enough oil for everyone, the countries with energy have choices. The countries without it have to negotiate. By the third month, the shortage would begin producing a different kind of pressure. Not panic. Adaptation. Expensive oil would make alternatives that once seemed too costly suddenly more attractive. Companies would search for different suppliers, shorter shipping routes, more efficient vehicles, and ways to produce the same goods with less fuel. Governments could release additional reserves, encourage conservation, and accelerate investment in other energy sources. And some missing production could eventually return if producers were able to increase output. But adaptation would come with a price. Countries that depend heavily on imported oil could face higher costs for transport, food, and trade. Businesses would have to decide which operations were worth keeping. Consumers would change their habits because they had to, not because they wanted to. And adaptation wouldn't happen equally. Wealthier countries could afford to invest in efficiency, alternative energy, and new supply routes. Industries with flexible operations could adjust faster. Poorer, oil-dependent economies might have fewer options and face higher costs for much longer. Some industries would recover faster than others. Some countries would find new suppliers. Others might simply have to consume less. Over time, these small changes would begin adding up. The world wouldn't replace the missing 20% with one perfect substitute. It would reorganize around having less, one route, one vehicle, one factory, one shipment at a time. The shortage would not disappear. The world would learn how to operate around it. Losing 20% of the world's oil would not automatically bring civilization to a halt. That is the important part. The world has reserves, alternative suppliers, spare production capacity, different energy sources, and the ability to reduce demand when prices rise. But those buffers have limits. The first thing to break would probably not be the power grid. It wouldn't be every gas station going empty. And it wouldn't be civilization itself. It would be flexibility. The ability to absorb a sudden shock without forcing millions of people, businesses, and countries to compete for what remains. Some people would drive less. Some businesses would pay more. Governments would prioritize essential services. Countries with domestic production would gain leverage, while import-dependent nations would face harder choices. Eventually, the world would adapt. But that adaptation would come from thousands of changes made under pressure. Because oil is not simply fuel sitting underground. It is part of the machinery that moves food, people, products, and entire economies around the planet. So if 1/5 of that supply suddenly disappeared, the biggest lesson would not be that the world cannot survive without oil. It would be something more uncomfortable. The world can live with less oil. It just isn't built to lose it all at once.